Hey, Nick with CC Minis here, and today we're going to build and paint a Vaporwave Space Marine. Alright, let's do this. Let's start with this box. Dang, it is a pretty sweet box, you might say. It's looking just a little too boxy though, so let's paint that black. I have this 3D printed grid from my Vaporwave Warcry board that I want to use as ground for this box. Kind of like the grid in Tron, or the ground in Synthwave and Outrun pieces, like this. I'm going to put in some sort of spacer so it looks like it's floating on a void. And then I'll have the Marine Biker sit on top of that. I marked where my spacers were going to go, keeping in mind that I need some in the center of the grid so it doesn't sag under this chunky Marine's weight. For the spacers, let's go nuts. Like, nuts? Why do I do this? These were fixed with a couple dollops of super glue. Oops, I got a little bit too much there. Yeah, that's looking like a nice height. Let's start painting that Marine. I started out by priming this Marine with a light gray. Then I base coated different parts of the bike with a bluish greenish jade color. Black for all the bits that would be metal or leather. A mix of jade and white for the main front bike panels. And then a bright magenta for the Space Marine himself. To add in shadows to the Marine and darker bike bits, I glazed on a magenta ink. Glazing is basically using a super thin down paint to slightly shift the color with each layer. Darkening a magenta with a darker magenta is pretty intuitive. Darkening the jade this way makes sense too, if you don't think about it. Or, if you do. Since they are nearly opposite on the color wheel, magenta will desaturate and darken the jade at the same time. This step took a little while though, so let's go back to the box while I finish this up. Don't think about this too hard, this segue totally makes sense. I ended up spray painting the box a nice blue color off camera. The airbrush black was looking just a little too patchy for me. That sort of cardboard really just soaks up the paint. The 3D printed grid is a little too thin to be pure white, so I mixed up some white with just a Smurf's fart of blue in it, and quickly airbrushed the full grid to make it brighter, before mounting the grid to the nuts with some super glue. I trimmed the excess grid to contain the scene within the edges of the box. Alright, let's let that glue dry and finish up the Marine. Next step on the biker is to do some edge highlighting. This technique does a great job in calling out all the different edges of the piece, and it makes the separation between different panels and parts more distinct. For the green bits, I mixed up jade with a bright yellow color. And on the brighter front panels, I used a pure white. While continuing to edge highlight, I'd like to thank some of the highlights of my life. My patrons. Thank you guys so much for the support. It really means the world to me, and I don't know if I'd be doing this without you guys. Thank you so much. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there's a link to the Patreon page right down there. Anyway, back to painting. At this point, I felt like the magenta Marine was still a bit too flat. So I used a green ink to add in some starker shadows. Just like the magenta ink on the jade, this step darkens and desaturates the magenta, giving it more depth. Next, I quickly hit all the metal bits with a dark steel color. And while that dried, I used some thinned down magenta ink to cover in the eyes. I did my best while painting the helmet to leave these nice and bright white. This way ink can flow in and pool a bit, darkening the edges of the eyes, but keeping the center nice and bright. The large section of the bike is a beautiful little canvas. Let's do some freehand there. And I have just the idea. Remember these bad boys from the 90s? Let's see if we can recreate that design here. I started out with some thin jade paint and sketched in the overall zigzaggy shapes. Then I used a sponge over those shapes to reinforce the color and give the brush strokes some texture. Then I went back in with some thicker jade color and filled in the zigzags. The magenta ink I've been using is perfect for that thin, poppy line on those 90s cups. A few quick, confident strokes later, and we are at a pretty great place with the freehand. The kind of freehand was really fun to do. If you can think of any cool, nostalgic looking patterns or images that would be fun to throw into a diorama, let me know in the comments below. While rotating the model and admiring my nostalgic handiwork, I noticed that I forgot to edge highlight the magenta. So I mixed up some of that bright magenta with a yellowy white and got to work. Last steps in the paint job were doing some highlights on the metal with a bright aluminum. Then I hid the metal with a controlled coating of glossy Nuln Oil, which will help in adding contrast to the metal bits while retaining their glossy luster. Now that the Marine is finished, it's time to adhere him to that display box thing. A couple globs of super glue should hold him in place. I used a bit of accelerant to help keep him at the angle that I wanted while the glue dried. Next up was creating one of those sweet Tron bike trails. I made this out of a sheet of thin styrene. I cut a small semicircle out of the half that would be coming off of the wheel. Then I quickly painted it with a bright blue gradient and stuck it to the grid with super glue. Next, I wanted to make it look like the Marine's sword was breaking the grid as it passed through. So I clipped up some parts of the grid where the sword would have passed, and tried to bend the grid with a pair of tweezers. This wound up being a little bit of a bad idea. I think bending the PLA at that tight of an angle was just too much for it to handle. So I tried heating up the grid with a hairdryer to make the print more pliable. Yeah, also not the brightest idea. This quickly warped the grid all around, and I had to swiftly go back in with my hands and bend things into shape. I ended up having to add in another nut to correct this mistake as well. After painting that nut and the edge of the box black though, I was really happy with it. And here we have the finished piece. A Vaporwave Space Marine biker with some hints of nostalgia. Thanks for sticking around to the end, y'all. If you want to see some more Vaporwave inspired Warhammer content, I got the perfect playlist for you here. If you enjoyed the video, it'd mean a lot to me if you hit that little like button and leave a comment down below. As always, y'all, stay healthy and take care. Bye-bye. I'm done.